enable it so I can share host or share screen. Okay. Okay, so today's lesson in our series is on the flood. And just to recap, as I always do, the purpose of this series is not to convince you or force you to agree with any of these ideas or thinkings. It is to inform us about current scientific understanding of these key topics, and hopefully to help to challenge, to rethink, or reaffirm our beliefs and viewpoints of God, and ultimately to get this last point of that what may be non-issues for us may prevent others from coming to Christ. And just to recap, since we're kind of getting towards the end of the series, in the first lesson, the main argument was to try and illustrate how science should be important to us as Christians and how it can expand our viewpoints of God and can ultimately help to bring more people to Christ if we kind of think along the way that scientists do. And in the second lesson, we kind of went into how the universe started with the Big Bang versus how the ancient Israelites and Hebrews viewed the world. And we'll bring that up a little bit again in the flood with how they viewed it with that dome structure and how that kind of correlates with the Noah flood story. And then also in lesson 3, we got to how the world was actually made with the new earth or old earth, and then how science said planets form, which is ultimately important for the age of the earth so that we can get to evolution, because evolution takes a long time to occur. And then we talk about kind of creation versus evolution and what science says about evolution. And today we're going to talk about the floods, the next part of Genesis. So just to outline the talk for tonight. Well, first we'll go the Bible, what the Bible says about the flood. Tonight we're pretty heavy on scriptures. There's not a ton of science to really speak of for this topic. It's a little bit clear cut from the science point of view. So I'll go a little quickly for that. But we'll talk about the flood as far as biblical. So if you have your Bible, we'll be in Genesis a lot this night. I'll have the views of the verses up on the screen too. We'll talk a little bit about other cultures say about floods and different flood stories that are different from different ancient Mesopotamia. Then we'll go into what science says about a worldwide flood, which will be pretty brief. And then we can talk about how this conflict can be resolved. So we'll kind of just start off with going into the flood story right off the bat into Genesis. So this is from Genesis 6, if you want to turn theirs in your Bibles, and we can also have the verses up on the screen. So I would really appreciate if anyone would like to read this first little section.
I can read. Which verses you said?
It's Genesis 6, 1 through 8.
Okay, yeah, just so everything on the screen. Very good. When human beings began to increase in numbers on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with them. Humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old and men of renown. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth at the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground. For I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord.
Thanks, Derek. We have a bunch of questions to kind of go about with this passage, but we'll kind of read kind of the whole picture of the story before we get to some of these questions. So the second passage we'll read kind of goes on straight after that in verses, actually we'll jump to kind of going all the way to chapter 7, verse 6. So we finally get to that flood. So if anyone would like to read this passage, it's chapter 7, verses 6 through 16.
I can do it.
Thanks.
Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters came on the earth. And Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives entered the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Pairs of clean and unclean animals, of birds and of all creatures that move along the ground, male and female, came to Noah and entered the ark as God had commanded Noah. And after the 7 days, the flood waters came on the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, on that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened, and rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. On that very day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, together with his wife and the wives of his 3 sons, entered the ark. They had with them every wild animal according to its kind, all livestock according to their kinds, every creature that moves along the ground according to its kind, and every bird according to its kind, everything with wings. Pairs of all creatures that have the breath of life in them came to Noah and entered the ark. The animals going in were male and female of every living thing, as God had commanded Noah. Then the Lord shut him in.
Thanks, Tom. So now in this part of the story, we finally have the flood occurring, and we also have several questions to kind of go about with this passage to talk about. But we'll go ahead and finish the story a little bit. So now we have the actual flood. So if someone would like to read this, this is chapter 7, 17 through 24, the continuation of the story.
And read it.
Thanks, Crystal.
For 40 days, the flood kept coming on the earth, and as the waters increased, they lifted the ark high above the earth. The waters rose and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. They rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits. Every living thing that moved on land perished. Birds, livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swarm all over the earth, and all mankind. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. People and animals and the creatures that move along the ground and the birds were wiped from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those with him in the ark. The waters flooded the earth for 150 days.
Thanks, Crystal. I think we might have the resolution. I think I stuck it in here. So now we finally have the flood. It wiped out everything. It lasted 150 days as far as the flood waters, and they slowly start to recede. And we'll kind of skip the whole sending out of the doves, and we'll get to the rainbow. So if anyone would like to read this resolution, it is jumps all the way to chapters 9, verses 12 through 16.
I'll read that one.
Thanks, Karen.
And God said, "This is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth."
Thanks, Karen. So the flood story is actually pretty long. It's all of 6, 7, 8, and 9 chapters of the Bible of Genesis. So I just kind of took little excerpts just so we could kind of catch everyone up. But then I kind of want to just ask a couple of questions. So the first question is, we're introduced to these kind of characters in this story called the sons of God and the daughters of humans. So who do you guys think are the sons of God and the daughters of human? I had heard about it before, but it's from the Bible Project when they talk about this in their God series. So the word they use for sons of God is actually like Elohim, which is what was first used in Genesis 1. So it kind of just references a spiritual being. So some of this is what he speculated is some of the kind of the dissenters of the spiritual realm that kind of lusted after the women of the earth and made these Nephilim is from the result of that. So it gets a little weird, but I just want to introduce that as an idea that's kind of interesting, that that's what the story talks about, and that's what kind of starts this whole wickedness of the earth. So the next question goes into is like, who are the Nephilim? I kind of took from it also is that, also you have to recognize when Genesis is being written and given to the Israelites as a body of text, and that's when they're about to go into the promised land. And some of the people in the promised land are supposed to be some of these Nephilim, these Anak people who are giants that they have to conquer. So I think one reason I think it's interesting God points it out here is that God's already destroyed the Nephilim once, and he can do it again with these Israelites about to go into the promised land, which I think is one reason why they're referenced here. But it's interesting, it says that they were on the earth in those days, but then also afterwards. So this is a continuing process that seems to be happening with this combination of man and spiritual beings. So it's just something interesting that picked up here, and then it's used later in the Bible. But also may point out that potentially maybe the flood didn't wipe out all creatures, and maybe they were still on the earth, or that this process is ongoing. So another question that happens when the flood is actually occurring is the springs of the deep, and then also the floodgates of heaven. So what do you guys think about that? I wanted to bring up is the significance of 40 days of rain. Does anyone have any thoughts on it? I can also speak as to what I kind of have seen in my studies. There's a lot of symbolism in here that's similar to the rest of Genesis, that it's not quite always literal, that it's very poetic and everything kind of serves a purpose. So definitely the 40 days is very symbolic, and is used later when the Israelites are wandering in the wilderness and Jesus being tempted also in the wilderness. There's also different times in Chronicles and during the Kings that there's 40-year reigns, and it's always very symbolic. So all good points. Way to go, Derek and Joe. And then ultimately, what do you think the purpose of the rainbow is? What does the flood reveal to you guys about the character of God, with kind of like beginning stages and then also like finally the resolution? I think that's all my questions. So kind of like now we kind of know the backstory of, what the Bible says. I mean, I know a lot of us have been reading this, like born on this story, and we've grown up with this story and we know it forwards and backwards, but it's always good to kind of go back in and look with it with fresh eyes. But flood stories are not very uncommon to a lot of different cultures. Basically, every single culture that is on the face of the earth has a flood story. And in fact, flood stories are so common that Greek philosophers thought it was part of the human condition to have a flood myth. And I forget his name, I don't want to butcher it either, but he thought that everyone has to like pee in the middle of the night, and so they dream up flood stories because they have to go to the bathroom. And so that's why he thought it was so commonplace. That's how he rationalized it in his ancient Greek mind.
That's wild.
Yeah. So it's an extremely common thing. Basically, every different tribe and tongue has their own flood story. So it's extremely common. The one that would have been most influential to the ancient Israelites coming out of the wilderness was, and it's also actually the most similar, is from the Epic of Gilgamesh. So kind of Samaria as well as the Babylonian era. So they have a flood narrative, and it's actually extremely, extremely similar. The ark they build is slightly smaller in scale, basically. But similar thing, that basically all the different gods are laying to destroy the earth, and one god kind of dissents and is like, well, I want to save humans. And so he goes and finds this human that has found favor with this god and tells him to build an ark and goes from there. So it's slightly smaller. The only difference is the bird they send out to determine there's land. It was a raven instead of a dove. So it's a very similar story, which to me either means that the Bible influenced this story, or vice versa a little bit, where they were pretty similar. But ultimately just share the same purpose, that God, as we mentioned, does have a wrath, but he also is kind and generous. and wants to rescue
That's
us.
gonna be pretty late then.
Josh, I'm not familiar with all the other flood stories of all the other cultures, but
Okay. Does he seem tired?
do they all deal with destruction of the earth?
Almost all of them. And normally it's usually out of the wrath of the gods that the humans have done something wrong. Not all of them are like a
Probably someone's first to
worldwide flood that everyone dies. The Gilgamesh one in the Bible, obviously, or everyone dies
Got it.
except for a few.
Okay.
I didn't read all of them. There's several links. A lot of the Native American ones, and kind of North and South American ones, a chosen few were
Right.
kind of like went up on
So
a mountain.
they usually taking a shower, then kind of send them to Maya,
Um,
and then they're gonna they're so you're gonna
Can
wait.
someone mute? I'm kind of hearing somebody.
Adam, you're not on mute, Adam.
Oh, sorry, guys.
Yeah, sorry. I was hearing mumbling. I didn't know if I was reverberating through someone's.
Sorry, this is just trying to get used to this new family business.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
All good. But to answer your question, Don, not all of them are all death, but usually all of them that I read 10 or 12 of them, all start with wrath. And then it depends if they kind of found favor or if it was just kind of a lucky few that survived. But it's extremely common, which is something I didn't realize. And Gilgamesh is definitely the most similar to the Bible one. So that's what other cultures are saying. So they're definitely influenced. Either, probably most likely the Bible influenced the other ones, but they are very similar, especially for the ancient Middle East area. So now, what does science actually say about all this? So as far as science and a worldwide flood, the simple answer is basically it can't happen. As far as we know the world, as far as Genesis sets up the earth, everything is watered by the mist until the flood, and then rain starts coming on the earth. A world where rain isn't actually like a phenomenon. We don't have physical principles for that, just because what we know is, when there's water, the sun heats it up, it becomes clouds, and they condense and they precipitate in forms of rain, sleet, or snow. So as far as we know the world, it can't happen. So it definitely would have to been some kind of miracle in the sense for some of this period of time for it to work the way the Bible states it. I'll kind of go into some of it. The question is why. I left a few out. There's lots of reasons. Some of the reasons we've kind of already talked about. One is timeline. So if Noah did happen when we think it did, for a worldwide flood to occur, we wouldn't have as many people on the earth as we did. As far as like locations, like for, let's say, like the Americas, how we explain it with science is that there was a land bridge during the last ice age, and they were able to come across on that land bridge, and that's how they populated the Americas. If a flood happened 6,000 years ago, the land bridge would have already been closed, and so all those people would have been wiped out, and we wouldn't have been able to repopulate them. The only way you can kind of get around that is with the Tower of Babel, which chronologically, in terms of our modern day Bible, happens after Noah's flood, where God scatters the people, so then you could have people repopulate the Americas. But it's definitely kind of a weird way to get to it. Evolution, as far as diversity, we wouldn't be able to have as much diversity as we have with all the things going on the ark. We could definitely get a lot of species on the ark because it's very massive, as Karen pointed out, if you go to Kentucky and see it. I haven't yet, but I've had friends go. And we could definitely fit a lot of species on the earth. But the number of different insects and different bugs that we have, as well as freshwater fish and animals, it just wouldn't have really been possible. And so it's hard to believe in a worldwide flood if we believe in the evolution principles of evolution. Also, how rainbows work. Basically, anytime there's falling water, when light hits it, it makes a prism and makes that rainbow effect. So you can take, your hose back outside, do little water droplets, and if you're in the sun, you can see a rainbow happen. So anytime there's any kind of amount of falling water, we should get a rainbow if the sun's shining. So to say it didn't happen before and then now it does, it would have to be some kind of miracle where God's changing the rules of physics and chemistry for that to work. So it's definitely stacked against it for a worldwide flood as far as we know science today. Not to say it can't happen. So we'll talk about how we can kind of resolve that. So for a worldwide flood, if there was a worldwide flood, and then for science to agree with it, it would have to happen much longer ago. You could get to that then if you did it thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of years ago instead of just 6,000 years ago, then you could get diversity coming back because evolution just takes time. So that could work if you really felt convicted that it was a worldwide flood, for it to agree with science as we know it. I'm more likely to kind of inclined to go with a local flood as the best resolution. I know some people had said that in the survey at the beginning. So with the idea of a local flood, it means the story was definitely still true and you had Noah building an ark and that there was flood. And since most people did live in this, what's called like, the Fertile Crescent, so a lot of people are living between the Tigris and the Euphrates, it would wipe out most populations of the earth. That can still work and still work with science, because then you're not wiping out all populations of the earth. The people in the Americas are still there to repopulate. You're still having a lot of animals and plants still being alive, even though most of the people are wiped out. I think it's the Bible Institute or something like that. Don't hold me to this, but they try to apply scientific principles to this. And they estimated that like 90% of humans would die if there was a really severe local flood in ancient Mesopotamia, because that was where most of human life was at that time. So definitely a local flood definitely works, and it's not that hard to go with. The next part kind of leads into what we'll be talking about next week with miracles. Obviously, if we evoke that it was a miracle, that implies science has nothing to do with it, and that God's all-powerful, as we mentioned before, and that he could flood the earth and kill all humans except for Noah, and that be perfectly fine. And then physics would go back to normal, things would go back to normal. So it's definitely possible, and it's kind of a card you can play, the miracle card, because then science no longer applies to that. I will say, I think it was also the Bible Institute, but another thing I don't think I mentioned with evolution. So in our human cells, we have a little thing that, I don't know, if people my age always call it the powerhouse of the cell, but it's called the mitochondria, and it makes all the energy for our cells. But it actually has a little bit of DNA in it. But all your mitochondria only come from the mother. So you can only get it from the mother. The father doesn't pass on any mitochondrial DNA. So we can actually use that to trace back lineages, because we know exactly whose mother is whose mother. And we did that, and we kind of did sequencing of mitochondrial DNA from a bunch of different people from around the world. And we got back that there were 8 individuals that they call mitochondrial Eves, that they were the original people that produced all people on the planet, which doesn't quite fit with the Noah story, but it's decently close, and kind of within the range, because they couldn't quite estimate exactly the number. So some Christian scientists have said that's evidence that the flood did wipe out everyone, and that Noah and his wife and his sons' wives were the first people, and that repopulated the whole planet. So that is some evidence for a worldwide flood wiping out everyone. But that's basically it. So it's a quick and easy lesson for tonight. That's all I have. I'm not super passionate about the flood, so it's a little hard to come up with material for it. So I can take any questions if you guys have any other thoughts while we went through this resolution part and other cultural things. But that's all I have as far as material for tonight.